There's a very strong relationship between economic growth and energy growth, particularly between growth of electricity demand and also of oil demand. And one of the reasons is that as the economy grows, nearly always transport more stuff, people drive to more places, they fly to more places, more tourism, more everything, more food comes from far distant places. We're basically moving more molecules faster to more places in greater quantity, and all of this moving of molecules takes a great deal of energy, and most of that energy is oil.
And this is where peak oil comes in, because the implication of peak oil is that oil prices are going to become more volatile, and that the average price of oil is going to remain structurally higher than it has in decades. And if that happens, then the economic value securing this American debt structure has got to be valued downwards by some factor. Let's call it X. And factor X is the thing that threatens the United States most.
What happens if, especially your key energy feedstock, which is oil, what happens if that goes into decline? And it seems to many of us analyzing this that it's unavoidable, the conclusion is unavoidable, that economic contraction will be the result of this. I've not seen any convincing evidence that will not be so.
The economy is really kept afloat by the confidence of investors and consumers that economic growth is going to continue. If there's a widespread perception that the economy is going to contract, people will stop taking out new loans. People will stop buying new houses. Investors will stop investing. And the consequence of that is that the economy will begin to shrink. If the economy is not continually growing, that means new loans aren't being taken out, and new loans are the means by which the money supply expands. Money is created through the making of loans. So if more money isn't being created, that means that not enough money will exist to pay back existing loans at interest. That means there will be foreclosures, and when that happens, money effectively starts to disappear from the economy.
The decline itself is not really a serious crisis, but as the financial community wakes up that the growth is no longer possible, and this decline has not only started, but it's going on, it's not just a little downturn, it's a beginning of a new age, that this could cause quite a shock. I mean, it could cause resource wars for people to try and get access to what is left. It could, I think personally, it probably heralds the second Great Depression, that somehow they've got to wipe out just mountains of capital.
Irrespective of the peak itself, I think there'll be such a gap between the available supply and the desire, if you like, the demand, that it'll already cause huge trouble. Now that may coincide with the peak and that may not. So that will be a very interesting period of time to look at in terms of public reaction. And I mean, once you start seeing gas lines, once you see petrol stations, gasoline stations running out of gasoline, once you start seeing trucks on American roads and on European roads just broken down and run out of diesel on the side of the road, not having made their deliveries, supermarket shelves going empty, once you start seeing that kind of thing, it's going to be very, very difficult for opinion leaders, for the media, for politicians, for corporate executives. It's going to be very difficult for them to spin a tale which explains that without actually admitting that actually the reason is that we're at peak oil and we're facing decline.
Not that they don't know. I mean, governments are extremely well briefed. Their leading officials make sure that they're in contact with all the leading organizations in the country, particularly sort of business and certainly the oil industry, which is so important. They will have talked exhaustively about this. So it's not as though they don't know, and it's not as though the leaders are not briefed. Of course they are.
If you're a politician in a country that matters, and you say, I've got a concern about oil depletion, what's your next sentence? What do you say after that? You've essentially just said, the world as you know it is going to end. End of, and that's all we have today. I mean, you really have to be able to follow up with some sense of some policy, some solution, because there really is no easy solution at hand. Politicians are really loath to get into the whole notion of depletion. You can't raise a problem unless you've got a solution at hand. I mean, that's kind of the rule of politics, unless you're criticizing your opponent. And so no one really wants to raise the notion of depletion.
Of course, one would expect the politicians across the world to have begun to get together to talk about the implications and what each of them needs to do in order to deal with this threat. I suspect the reason that doesn't happen is because the United States, the far and away the most powerful country of the world, has decided that it doesn't want to convene an international conference to discuss how it's going to be shared out. What they have decided to do, pretty clearly from invading Iraq and trying to control oil from the Caspian Basin, which is the second largest repository of oil that is left in the world, is to try and monopolize for themselves the supply of this oil, because oil is power.
Without cheap oil, the American empire would never have come about. Certainly as in anything like the form that we know it. Cheap oil has been absolutely critical to the construction of the political economy that is the United States today. And if you remove cheap oil, then that political economy has to change profoundly.
The mainstream media, I think, have done an abysmal job of reporting on the events of 9/11, on peak oil, and other things that really impact our lives. I mean, the average person knows much more about the personal habits of Brad Pitt than they know about peak oil, and what's going to affect their life in the near future. I mean, if they don't have food to eat, if they don't have a job, that's something they need to know about beforehand. That's something they need to prepare for. And peak oil is the event of our lifetimes. It's going to dwarf anything that any of us has experienced in our lives up to this point. And yet we're told virtually nothing about it. Same thing with 9/11. I mean, here was the great political event, so-called terrorist event of our lifetimes. The world has changed profoundly as a result of it. And yet there's absolutely no real investigative reporting about it in the mainstream media. Instead, we have a lot of very courageous, independent investigative journalists who find it impossible to get their work published in the mainstream. It's a disastrous situation. I personally believe that there is a deep relationship between the events of 9/11 and peak oil, but it's not something I can prove. There's a lot of circumstantial bits and pieces that when you add them up together paint a pretty persuasive picture, I think. The CIA has been studying the phenomenon of oil peaks since the 1970s. And Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, the world's foremost oil services company, has talked about the difficulty that the oil industry will have in meeting demand by the end of the first decade of the 21st century. Now, what happened after 9/11? Well, of course, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and used that occasion to build military bases throughout the region of Central Asia, which is the new oil production region. Lots of new oil discoveries there in, coincidentally, 2000 to 2001.